Brooke Logan had always been at the center of storms, not because she sought them, but because she had, for better or worse, become the emotional axis around which the Forrester family revolved. From Ridge to Bill, from Eric to Deacon, and through generations of chaos, passion, betrayal, and loyalty, she had played the role everyone expected. The woman torn between love and legacy, always sacrificing, always bending herself into shapes that could keep the peace, if only temporarily. But now, with the weight of too many years pressing down on her chest, and the cold exhaustion of a marriage that had once again unraveled under the pressure of pride and unspoken wounds, Brooke stood on the edge of something terrifying: freedom. Not the poetic kind, but the raw, uncertain kind, freedom to choose herself. And it was in that most fragile moment that Nick Marone returned. He didn't come with roses or declarations of love. He came with a proposition. Business.
Clean.
Strategic. A new company, untainted by the ghosts of Forrester or Spencer or Logan drama. It wasn't just a chance to escape. It was a challenge. Build something new. On her own terms. Stand as a woman no longer defined by the men who claimed her or the families that drained her. And the offer didn't stop at business. Nick made it clear that he believed in her. Not as a romantic notion, not as a muse, but as a force. A partner. Someone whose brilliance had been dimmed too long by the War of Dynasties. At first, Brooke dismissed the idea with the reflex of a woman trained to survive within her usual orbit. She couldn't imagine life outside the Forrester framework. But slowly, as days passed and the silence between her and Ridge thickened with everything left unsaid, the offer began to echo louder. Nick wasn't promising paradise, he was offering agency. And that was more intoxicating than any love letter Ridge had ever written. Ridge, of course, sensed the shift. He always did. But instead of asking why Brooke was pulling away, he did what he had done so many times before. He tightened his grip. Not with affection or vulnerability, but with control disguised as concern. He spoke of family, of legacy, of how much Brooke was needed at Forrester. He reminded her of everything they had built, every storm they had weathered. But beneath his words was a current she had ignored for years. Ridge didn't see her. He saw what she meant to him, what she represented in his world. The woman who made his house feel like home. The voice that soothed his pride. The heart that forgave him, always. She wasn't a partner in his vision. She was a mirror. And for the first time, Brooke saw it clearly. Every time she had tried to stand alone, Ridge had pulled her back, not with cruelty, but with expectation. With the subtle insistence that she belonged in his story, even if her own story had no room to grow within it. The realization was devastating. Ridge loved her, but did he respect her independence? Did he ever truly believe she could exist outside of him? And worse, had she spent her life proving him right by always returning? Nick, meanwhile, made no promises of eternal love. He offered Brooke nothing more and nothing less than partnership. A chance to build a company without the baggage of fashion family feuds. A life where her decisions were not filtered through the lens of Ridge's approval or Bill's manipulation. He wasn't asking her to leave for him. He was asking if she remembered how to leave for herself. Brooke found herself caught between two truths. One was familiar, the role of the heroine who saved the family, who absorbed the damage and emerged stronger, only to repeat the cycle. The other was terrifyingly new, stepping off the carousel and letting it spin without her. Could she really walk away from the identity that had become synonymous with her name? Could she let Ridge go, not just as a lover, but as the gravitational force in her life? The turning point came quietly. Ridge confronted her late one evening, his tone not cruel, but laced with the frustration of a man used to being the center. He accused her of chasing a fantasy with Nick, of abandoning everything they had fought for. Brooke asked, softly, whether he believed she could thrive without him. Whether he thought she had the strength to succeed on her own. Ridge hesitated. Not long, but long enough. And that was her answer. She packed without theatrics. No farewell speeches. No drawn-out goodbye. Just a simple note on the nightstand. This time, I choose me. The press spun the story into scandal. Brooke Logan leaves Forrester. Brooke and Nick reunited? Ridge remained stoic in public, but behind closed doors he boiled. Not because he had lost Brooke, but because he had lost control of the one person who always came back. He convinced himself she'd return again. She always did. But as weeks passed and Brooke didn't call, didn't visit, didn't look back, a new fear took root in him. Maybe this time was different. And it was. Brooke threw herself into the new venture. Not to spite Ridge, not to impress Nick, but to finally test the limits of her own voice. The business was tough, unglamorous in its early days, filled with long hours and difficult choices. But it was hers. Every mistake, every triumph. Hers. And in that ownership, she began to rediscover a version of herself long buried beneath decades of devotion and compromise. Nick remained a steady presence, supportive, professional, and occasionally flirtatious in the way only he could be. But he never pressed for more. He didn't need to. Because for the first time, Brooke wasn't being courted, she was being respected. And that, more than anything, reminded her of her worth. Back at Forrester, the absence of Brooke rippled through every hallway. Eric tried to maintain balance, but Ridge's mood darkened by the day. Steffi questioned his motives. Hope, though hurting from her own heartbreak, silently admired her mother's courage. And Bill, ever the opportunist, began to realize that Brooke's silence meant she was no longer choosing between them. She was choosing herself. Ridge made one final attempt. He visited Brooke's office, unannounced, bringing with him old sketches, shared memories, and the desperate hope that love alone could rewrite history. Brooke listened. She didn't interrupt. She let him speak. When he was done, she stood, walked over to the window, and looked out, not away from him, but toward herself. I will always love you, Ridge, she said, her voice calm but resolute. But I don't belong to you anymore. And maybe I never did. She didn't cry. She didn't chase. She let him go the way she had always wished someone would let her go, with dignity. And as Ridge walked away, alone this time, truly alone, Brooke turned back to her desk. There was a proposal to revise, a design to approve, a meeting to prepare for. Life, at last, was hers. For the first time in decades, Brooke Logan was no one's muse. She was no one's redemption arc, no one's prize. She was the author of her own story. And she was just getting started. The sun had barely risen over the hills of Los Angeles when the calm before the storm broke. While the usual chaos unfolded at Forrester Creations, with Ridge and Brooke circling each other in another emotionally exhausted standoff, Bill Spencer manipulating board members behind the scenes, Katie trapped between loyalty and self-worth, Hope retreating into grief, and Steffi clinging to her vision of legacy, a quiet upheaval was already underway, one that none of them had prepared for. Not because it was hidden, but because it had been forgotten. A sealed document. A final word from a man who had always understood his family better than they understood themselves. Eric Forrester, patriarch, artist, and for decades the spiritual and professional compass of the fashion dynasty, had rewritten his will during the peak of his illness. And now, after months of whispered updates, it was time to unveil his last declaration of love, disappointment, and challenge to the family that bore his name. They gathered at the Forrester mansion, summoned not by rumor, but by a sharply worded message from Eric's legal representative, a young but unnervingly composed attorney named Jordan Avery. Unlike the usual legal vultures who circled dying empires, Jordan was precise, clinical, but also strangely passionate about the integrity of Eric's intentions. He didn't arrive with a stack of contracts or a room full of assistants. He arrived with a single leather folder and a fireproof drive. When he entered the iconic living room, paintings of Eric's past creations surrounding them like silent judges, he asked for silence and, miraculously, received it. The reading began as expected, mentions of charitable donations, protections for staff members who had been with the family for decades, and brief nods to past relationships. Then came the shift. Eric had not only redistributed his shares of Forrester Creations, but had tied them to a detailed clause, a moral evaluation framework, one designed to assess each heir's commitment to integrity, responsibility, and loyalty, not just to the company, but to each other. It was not enough to be talented. It was not enough to be a Forrester by blood. Eric had, in his final act of stewardship, designed a test of character, and it had already begun. Months ago, when his health first declined. Gasps escaped as Jordan revealed what followed. Private investigators had been hired. Documents had been collected. Phone calls recorded. Betrayals catalogued. Not to shame them, but to mirror them. To show each of them who they had become in the shadows of Eric's failing health. And one by one, those shadows came to light. Ridge, visibly shaken, was the first to speak. He demanded clarification, confident that his years of sacrifice for the company would outweigh any emotional missteps. But Jordan held his gaze calmly as he revealed confidential communications Ridge had attempted to delete, emails to foreign investors, laying the groundwork for a potential buyout if Eric's condition proved fatal. Ridge had not betrayed Eric out of malice, but out of fear. Still, it was a disqualifying act under Eric's code. Brooke sat frozen. She, too, had been under scrutiny, her shifting allegiances between Bill and Ridge laid bare. Jordan cited a particularly damning moment. Brooke, aware of Eric's precarious health, had supported a restructuring plan that would have gutted the company's charitable branches in favor of increasing shareholder leverage, at Bill's suggestion. Her justification had been stability, but Eric saw it as betrayal of purpose. Bill didn't even pretend to be surprised. He smirked, arms crossed, as if daring the room to be shocked by his methods. But even he blinked when Jordan played audio from a private call between Bill and a legal strategist discussing ways to leverage Katie's shares if Eric were to die without finalizing his trust. Katie, seated next to him, turned pale. Steffi rose from her chair, indignant. She insisted she had done nothing to harm Forrester, had only protected it. But then came the footage. Internal security logs showing her authorization of a cover-up regarding Thomas's aggressive boardroom behavior, an incident that had nearly caused a lawsuit from a major collaborator. It had been swept under the rug. For the good of the brand, she had said in an email. Eric, however, had always believed that truth, not image, was the soul of Forrester. Hope, already reeling from her personal heartbreak, was confronted with something more subtle. Not betrayal, but silence. When asked to testify in support of a designer who had accused a board member of coercion, she had chosen to stay quiet to preserve family unity. Eric had seen it differently. He had called it cowardice in his notes. And then Jordan turned the room on its axis. There is one more name, he said, unfolding the final page. The heir of moral succession. The one Eric named not because of power or title, but because of choices, quiet, principled, often unnoticed. The silence was suffocating. Each powerful figure sat bracing for an old name, perhaps Thorne or even Donna. But what came next left the room in stunned disbelief. R.J. Forrester.
Ridge un geste sans.
The one they had all assumed was still finding himself. The quiet one. The artist without ambition, the child who had stepped away from the infighting, from the boardroom wars, from the endless pursuit of control. While the others schemed, RJ had built quietly designs that impressed Eric, not because of innovation alone, but because they were honest. RJ had refused offers from Steffi and Thomas to co-sign their power plays. He had declined when Brooke asked him to align with her strategy. He had refused to sell sketches when offered cash by Spencer Media. RJ had done nothing that screamed leadership, and in that nothingness, he had become everything Eric believed Forrester could be again. The room erupted. Ridge demanded it be overturned. Brooke pleaded that RJ was too young. Steffi called it sentimental. Bill called it insanity. Katie cried. Hope, for the first time, smiled, sadly but genuinely. Because she saw it too. RJ hadn't wanted this. He hadn't lobbied for it. And that made him worthy in a way none of them were anymore. RJ entered the room late, unaware of the storm brewing. When told of his grandfather's decision, he looked stunned, then quietly devastated. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "But if this is his last wish, I'll honor it. I just don't want to become what this company has made the rest of you become." That single sentence gutted the room more than any clause. In the weeks that followed, Forrester Creations turned inside out. RJ, with the help of trusted outsiders, began reevaluating every department. He didn't seek revenge.
He sought clarity.
He invited his siblings and parents to stay, but only if they could work under a new standard: transparency, kindness, purpose. Some left. Some stayed, wounded but willing. Brooke, perhaps the most torn, visited RJ late one evening, standing outside the office that once belonged to Eric. "I don't know who I am if I'm not at the center," she confessed. RJ looked at her with a depth far beyond his years. "Maybe now you finally get to be yourself. Not someone else's heart, just your own." And that, in the end, was what Eric had always hoped for. Not a perfect family, but a better one. Sheila Carter was never a woman you could predict. Her madness didn't scream. It simmered, quietly corroding the boundaries of reason, pushing at the edges of whatever reality she chose to inhabit. But lately, something in her had shifted. The careful line she once walked between menace and manipulation had vanished, replaced by increasingly erratic behavior that even those closest to her couldn't ignore. Her words had grown more fragmented, her movements more disjointed, and her eyes, once calculated, now constantly flickering, suggested that her grip on control was slipping. No longer just a former threat, she had transformed into an active danger, especially to those who had once tried to save her. And no one understood this descent more intimately than Taylor Hayes. Taylor had always carried the weight of contradiction, therapist and mother, healer and victim, a woman who believed in redemption yet could never quite find her own peace. Years ago, when everyone else had written Sheila off as irredeemable, Taylor had tried to extend compassion. She had believed, however naively, that even the darkest soul had some flicker of light worth saving. But as she watched Sheila unravel now, snapping at allies, alienating Deacon, and toying dangerously with Hope and Finn's lives, Taylor came to a painful realization. Some people didn't want to be saved. Some people wanted to burn everything around them until nothing remained but chaos and power. And Sheila, in her current state, was the match and the gasoline. The guilt that followed Taylor's failed compassion twisted inside her like a blade. She had once thrown herself between Sheila and a bullet. Now, she wished she had let the bullet find its mark. But remorse wasn't enough, not anymore. The consequences of her mercy had grown too large, too loud, too destructive. And so, in a moment of chilling clarity, Taylor decided to stop being the therapist and start being the protector. Quietly, secretly, she reached out to Deacon Sharp, the one man whose connection to Sheila was both intimate and conflicted enough to be useful. Deacon had seen the cracks too. As much as he defended Sheila in public, behind closed doors, he confessed his fears. She was unraveling, he admitted. Dangerous, not just in the way she had always been, but in a new, untethered way. He didn't want to give her up, but he also didn't want to wake up one day to find that she had done the irreversible. And so Taylor presented her plan, cautiously. They would stage a confrontation, manipulate Sheila into revealing her worst instincts, catch it on record, and finally expose her to the public, to law enforcement, to the very people still naively orbiting her gravitational pull. It wasn't clean. It wasn't legal. But it was necessary, or so Taylor convinced herself. At first, everything unfolded as expected. Deacon acted as the emotional trigger, pushing Sheila into a corner with staged accusations and betrayal. Taylor, using her professional tools, decoded her responses, watching for the perfect moment to trap her in an admission of guilt or threat. But it wasn't enough. Sheila, unpredictable as ever, veered off script. Her reaction wasn't one of rage. It was cold, devastating clarity. She saw through it. Every feigned emotion, every question, every quiet nod from Taylor behind a mirror. Sheila didn't scream. She smiled. And then she turned the tables. A week later, an anonymous tip reached the state medical board. Accompanying it was a cache of recordings. Taylor speaking of baiting a patient, Taylor coaching Deacon on how to manipulate a response, Taylor referencing her intent to push Sheila toward a psychological breakdown for the sake of safety. All framed as evidence of unethical behavior. Worse, the footage had been edited just enough to remove any context of safety or threat. What remained was damning. A respected psychiatrist orchestrating psychological entrapment. The fallout came quickly. Taylor was summoned to appear before a disciplinary panel. Her license was suspended pending investigation. The press caught hold of it within days, splashing headlines across gossip columns and medical journals alike.
Dr.
Taylor Hayes, the therapist who tried to break her patient. Public sympathy was mixed. Some saw her as a woman driven to desperation. Others painted her as a hypocrite, another elite who believed the rules didn't apply when emotions ran high. Behind closed doors, Taylor unraveled. She had gambled everything on one final chance to stop Sheila, and now, not only had she failed, she had become vulnerable to the very judgment she once levied against others. Ridge tried to comfort her, but his words felt shallow. Steffi, furious and protective, blamed everyone, Deacon, Sheila, the system. But the worst wound came from within, the slow realization that in her attempt to stop a monster, Taylor had started to resemble one. Sheila, meanwhile, basked in the chaos. With Taylor discredited, she slithered back into conversations, back into Deacon's orbit, back into Finn's periphery. She didn't need to do much. Her enemies were destroying themselves. Her words now came with the weight of someone vindicated. They tried to paint me as the villain. But who's really dangerous now? It was the kind of manipulation only she could master, victimhood laced with venom. Taylor was offered a way out, resign quietly, surrender her license permanently, and avoid a public trial. It would protect her from complete professional annihilation. But it would also mean accepting that everything she stood for, ethics, integrity, compassion, had collapsed under pressure. Ridge begged her to take the deal. He said it didn't change who she was. But Taylor couldn't ignore the truth. She had crossed a line. Not out of malice, but out of fear. And now that line stood between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. She spent long nights alone, reviewing every decision, every justification. Could she really say she was different from Sheila if both had manipulated reality to bend others to their will? The difference, she realized, wasn't in the action, it was in the aftermath. Sheila never felt remorse. Taylor couldn't breathe without it. And so, Taylor chose to tell the truth. In a press conference surrounded by journalists, peers, and skeptics, she stood before cameras and admitted her role in the attempted entrapment. She detailed the motivations, the fear, the ethical breaches. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't justify her actions. She simply owned them. Her voice didn't tremble. Her eyes were clear. And as the flashbulbs lit up her face, something inside her broke and healed. The reaction was explosive. The medical board praised her honesty, but moved forward with disciplinary action. Her license would be suspended for 2 years, with mandatory ethical training and supervised practice upon return. It was a harsh sentence, but not a death sentence. It meant she could rebuild, slowly, painfully, but truthfully. Ridge stood by her side in public, but their private relationship grew strained. He admired her courage, but part of him couldn't look at her the same. Not because of what she had done, but because of what it revealed, that even the most stable among them were capable of unraveling. Taylor let him go quietly. She had lost too much pretending she didn't need time to heal. Sheila faded for now. Suspicion lingered, but with Taylor discredited, it would take time before anyone dared confront her again. Deacon withdrew, guilt eating at him, unsure if he had been used or if he had been complicit. Hope watched it all unfold with growing horror, wondering if she, too, would one day find herself standing at a crossroads between justice and madness. And Taylor, stripped of titles, reputation, and certainty, began again. Not as a doctor, not as a martyr, but as a woman who finally understood that righteousness without humility was just another form of control. She hadn't defeated Sheila, but she had faced the darkest part of herself and chosen to step back from the brink. And sometimes, that was the only victory that mattered.